Imagine a city street where every single house costs $50 million, yet every single window is completely dark. No one lives here. These aren't homes. They are high-end bank accounts built of brick-and-mortar. Welcome to London's ultra-prime real estate, a playground where foreign oligarchs, corrupt politicians, and shadowy billionaires turn dirty cash into clean, untouchable luxury property. And the system was designed to let them get away with it. Introduction. For decades, the city that gave the world Big Ben, the royal family, and centuries of legal tradition quietly became something else entirely. A laundromat, not for clothes, but for the most suspicious money on the planet. Behind the antique door knockers and the manicured hedges of some of the most expensive streets on earth sits a financial machine so quiet, so polished, and so deeply embedded in the British economy that most people walking past it have no idea it even exists. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you will never look at a London townhouse the same way again. There are three names that matter more than any others in this story. Mayfair, Belgravia, Knightsbridge. These are not just neighborhoods. They are postal codes that function like vaults. Walk through Mayfair on any given evening, and you will pass rows of Georgian townhouses with pristine white facades, wrought iron balconies, and manicured hedges, and yet you will notice something strange. Almost no lights are on. These streets sit minutes from Buckingham Palace, wrapped in some of the most expensive real estate on earth, and yet they feel eerily empty, almost frozen in time, as if the buildings themselves are waiting for residents who never arrive. Belgravia, just to the south, is even more extreme. This neighborhood was originally designed in the 1800s as a showcase for British aristocracy, with sweeping white stucco terraces built around private garden squares that only residents could access. Today, many of those same garden squares are surrounded by homes quietly owned not by aristocratic families, but by holding companies registered thousands of miles away, in places most owners will never visit and most neighbors will never identify. Knightsbridge takes this further still. The famous One Hyde Park development, often called the most expensive apartment building in the world, became a global symbol of this phenomenon. Penthouses there have sold for over $140 million, with bulletproof glass panic rooms and underground parking elevators built directly into the design. Yet for years, many of its units sat dark, their owners rarely if ever setting foot inside. Security guards stood outside buildings with no one living in them. Concierge staff maintained apartments that no one ever called home. Why these specific micro-districts? History gave them prestige, and prestige became a currency of its own. Owning an address in Belgravia signals power the same way a Swiss bank account once did in the 20th century. But unlike a bank account, a house cannot easily be frozen, traced, or seized without a long and expensive legal fight across multiple jurisdictions. A townhouse in Mayfair is not just shelter. It is a vault with a postcode, a physical asset that holds and grows in value, while staying largely invisible to public scrutiny. And so a strange ecosystem emerged over the decades, one that most ordinary residents of London never fully noticed forming around them. Streets that look like exclusive residential neighborhoods are, in financial reality, something closer to storage units for the world's most untraceable fortunes. The architecture is beautiful. The intention behind many of these purchases is anything but transparent. Real estate agents in these neighborhoods learn to speak a different language entirely, one built around discretion, privacy, and silence, rather than simply square footage and school catchment areas. So, how does someone actually buy a $50 million mansion without anyone knowing who they really are? The answer lies in one of the most powerful and most misunderstood tools in the world of hidden wealth, the offshore shell company. Here's how it works. Step by step. Instead of buying property directly under their own name, a wealthy buyer sets up a company, often in a jurisdiction like the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, or Panama. This company exists almost entirely on paper. It has no employees, no offices, no real operations, no actual business activity of any kind. Its sole purpose, from the moment it is created, is to hold one single asset, the property itself. When the mansion is purchased, the official title deed does not list a human being. It lists the name of the shell company, something with a generic, forgettable name that reveals absolutely nothing about who actually controls it. For years, that company's true owner, known in legal terms as a beneficial owner, could remain completely anonymous, hidden behind layer after layer of lawyers, accountants, nominee directors, and corporate registries that simply did not require any disclosure whatsoever. This is not a small loophole. This is a structural feature of the global financial system. Investigations by transparency organizations have found that tens of thousands of properties across England and Wales have historically been owned through offshore companies, with a heavy concentration in exactly the kind of high-value London postcodes we just discussed. The British Virgin Islands alone has been linked to an enormous share of anonymously owned UK property, precisely because its corporate laws made ownership disclosure optional rather than mandatory for years. Think about what this actually enables for a corrupt official skimming funds from a national budget somewhere on the other side of the world. The money moves quietly from the home country into an account controlled by the shell company, often passing through several intermediary jurisdictions to further obscure its origin. The shell company then buys a mansion in London. The official's own name never appears on a single public document connected to that property. If a journalist or investigator in his home country ever asks where his wealth went, the trail simply stops at a corporate registry in a tax haven that legally has no obligation to tell anyone anything. It is worth pausing here to be fair and balanced. Not every shell company purchase is criminal. Plenty of legitimate investors, business owners, and even ordinary wealthy families use offshore structures for entirely legal tax planning, inheritance arrangements, or personal privacy reasons that have nothing to do with crime. Privacy itself is not inherently sinister. But the same opacity that protects a legitimate investor's privacy also protects a money launderer's secret. And for years, the United Kingdom built almost no meaningful wall between the two. The system simply could not, and in many cases still struggles to, distinguish between a discreet retiree and a dictator's brother-in-law. No criminal launders $100 million alone. They need help. And in London, that help came dressed in three-piece suits, carrying leather briefcases and speaking the calm, reassuring tone of trusted professionals. Meet the enablers, high-end real estate agents who specialize in selling to ultra-wealthy international buyers, often without asking too many uncomfortable questions about where exactly the money originated. Luxury solicitors who structure the offshore purchase from start to finish, drawing up contracts between shell companies with practiced, almost mechanical efficiency. Private wealth managers who quietly move funds between jurisdictions, smoothing out the kind of transaction that would raise immediate alarms in an ordinary high street bank. London built one of the most sophisticated versions of this professional enablers industry anywhere on the planet. Estate agencies dealing in 9- and 10-figure properties developed entire dedicated apartments specifically for serving international clients, frequently prioritizing discretion above almost every other consideration, including, critics argue, basic due diligence. Law firms in the City of London, some with histories stretching back centuries and reputations built on integrity, found a remarkably lucrative niche advising on offshore structures, specifically designed to maximize privacy for their wealthiest clients. Regulations did exist on paper throughout this period. Anti-money laundering rules required certain checks on buyers, including identity verification and source of funds documentation. But investigation after investigation by journalists and watchdog groups repeatedly found gaps large enough to drive a Bentley through. Estate agents were sometimes identified as the weakest link in the entire chain, because commission incentives on a $50 million sale can make rigorous due diligence feel like an expensive inconvenience rather than a serious professional duty. A 2 or 3% commission on a transaction like that is an enormous sum of money, and that incentive structure quietly shaped behavior across the entire industry. And then there are the introducers, the discreet fixers who connect wealthy foreign clients with exactly the right lawyer, the right private banker, the right estate agent, all while taking their own quiet cut of the transaction. These introducers often operate in the shadows between industries, technically regulated by no single body, yet essential to how the entire machine actually runs day to day. This entire ecosystem thrived not necessarily because every single participant was personally corrupt, but because the system itself rewarded looking the other way. A transaction completed quickly, quietly, and without friction was good for business. Asking too many uncomfortable questions was not. It is this network, lawyers, Agents, accountants, and wealth managers working in quiet coordination that transforms a suspicious pile of cash sitting in an unstable economy into a sparkling Belgravia townhouse with a perfectly legal, fully notarized paper trail. Without the enablers, the system simply does not function. They are, in many ways, the most important and least visible characters in this entire story. Now here is where the story becomes almost surreal. As more and more of these properties were bought purely as stores of value rather than as actual homes, entire neighborhoods began to empty out, even as their price tags soared into the stratosphere year after year. This is sometimes called lights out London, a phrase used by researchers and journalists to describe the strange, almost eerie phenomenon of incredibly expensive streets sitting almost entirely dark at night. Studies and surveys of certain prime central London postcodes have found startlingly high vacancy rates, with some luxury developments reporting that a significant share of their units stand empty for most of the year, occupied for only a handful of weeks, if at all. Doormen polish brass fixtures in lobbies that see almost no foot traffic. Housekeepers air out rooms that no one has slept in for months. Think about what this actually means for the city around it. A normal housing market works on a relatively simple principle: supply and demand driven by people who genuinely need somewhere to live, work, and raise families. But in the ultra-prime segment of London's market, demand is driven by something else entirely: the need for a safe, stable, legally protected place to park enormous sums of capital. These buyers are not comparing school districts or commute times or the quality of the local park. They are comparing legal jurisdictions, extradition treaties, and privacy protections. The result is a strange and uncomfortable bifurcation playing out across the same city. While ordinary Londoners face one of the most punishing housing affordability crises in the entire developed world, with young professionals, nurses, and teachers priced out of neighborhoods their own parents could once comfortably afford, entire blocks in Mayfair and Knightsbridge sit completely dark, owned by absentee billionaires who may visit once a year, if ever, often only during a brief social season. The wealth sitting behind those doors is very real. The human presence is not. This phenomenon carries consequences that extend well beyond just empty windows. Local businesses that once served genuine residential communities, the corner shops, the traditional pubs, the small family-run bakeries, struggle to survive on streets where almost nobody actually lives day to day. Some former residential garden squares have effectively become ornamental, beautiful to photograph, beautiful to walk past, yet economically and socially hollow at their core. Critics and urban researchers argue this slowly transforms parts of one of the world's truly great cities into something closer to a museum of wealth rather than a living, breathing neighborhood. And all the while, completely undisturbed by any of this, the empty mansions continue quietly appreciated in value year after year, rewarding their absent owners for doing absolutely nothing except waiting patiently for the market to keep climbing. For years, there was an even more direct pathway connecting foreign wealth to British residency, a program known officially as the Tier 1 Investor Visa, but nicknamed almost universally as the Golden Visa. The concept was simple on its surface, almost elegant in its simplicity. If a wealthy foreign national invested a substantial sum, historically £2 million or more, into the United Kingdom's economy, they could secure residency rights for themselves and their immediate family, with a clearly defined pathway toward permanent settlement and, eventually, full British citizenship. The original policy intention was to attract genuine entrepreneurial capital and productive economic investment into the country, the kind that might create jobs and fund new businesses. In practice, the program evolved into something quite different from its original design. Because the investment requirements were relatively broad, and the scrutiny applied to the money's actual origin was often minimal, the Golden Visa became an extremely attractive option for individuals whose underlying wealth could not easily withstand serious, sustained examination. A businessman with murky ties to a state-owned enterprise back home. A politically connected family quietly looking for a safe harbor outside an unstable or authoritarian regime. A person seeking insulation in advance against some future shift in political winds in their home country. Investigations and parliamentary reviews eventually found that a notable percentage of Golden Visa holders during certain periods came from jurisdictions widely associated with significant corruption risk. The program effectively created a fast lane around a normal immigration system, where, instead of years of standard, thorough immigration vetting, enormous capital alone could open the door almost immediately. Pair that visa with an anonymous shell company quietly holding a Belgravia mansion, and you have constructed a near-complete fortress, legal residency secured on one side, untraceable property secured on the other, each reinforcing protection of the other. Public pressure, dogged journalistic investigations, and growing political scrutiny eventually led the UK government to close the Tier 1 investor visa route entirely in the early 2020s, with officials publicly citing exactly these concerns about its use as a backdoor for dirty, unexplained money. But the visas already granted before that closure and the residency status they unlocked for thousands of individuals and their families did not simply vanish the moment the program closed. The legacy of the Golden Visa era still quietly echoes through London's wealthiest postcodes today, embedded in property ownership patterns that will likely take decades to fully unwind. Eventually, after years of mounting public pressure, the British government tried to fight back, and the centerpiece of that fight was a new legal tool called the Unexplained Wealth Order, often simply abbreviated as the UWO. Introduced in 2018, the concept behind a UWO was genuinely clever, even elegant in its legal design. Rather than requiring prosecutors to prove, beyond reasonable doubt, that a specific property was bought directly with criminal proceeds, something extraordinarily difficult to establish across international borders and competing legal systems, a UWO flips the entire burden of proof onto the property owner. If authorities can demonstrate that a person's known, documented, legitimate income could not plausibly explain how they afforded a particular property, the owner themselves is legally required to step forward and explain exactly where the money actually came from. Fail to provide a credible, verifiable explanation, and the asset can ultimately be seized by the state. On paper, this looked like an extremely powerful weapon against exactly the kind of opaque wealth we have been describing throughout this video. In practice, the real-world results were far more disappointing than supporters had hoped. The most famous early test case targeted the wife of a jailed Azerbaijani banker, a woman who had spent millions of pounds at the luxury department store Harrods over the years and owned substantial London property purchased through offshore structures. Authorities pursued her case publicly as a flagship test of this powerful new law, hoping it would set a strong precedent for future cases. But the legal battle dragged on for years, moving through appeal after appeal, hearing after hearing. Ultimately, the case collapsed under the weight of its own complexity, with the National Crime Agency facing a costly, embarrassing defeat and a significant legal bill that had to be covered using public funds. The very case meant to prove the power of the UWO instead became a cautionary tale about its practical limitations. Why did such a clever, well-designed legal tool struggle so badly when it actually reached a real courtroom? The answer comes back to something we have already discussed at length: the enablers and the resources they command. Billionaires and their families can afford the most aggressive, most experienced legal teams anywhere in the world, lawyers fully capable of fighting a single case for years on end, appealing every unfavorable ruling, and steadily exhausting comparatively modest resources of government agencies that operate on tight public budgets. A UWO might look genuinely intimidating in a government press release announcing its use, but in an actual sustained courtroom battle against essentially unlimited legal firepower, the playing field tilts dramatically and predictably in favor of the wealthy defendant. In the years since its introduction, only a small handful of unexplained wealth orders have actually been pursued by authorities, and fewer still have resulted in a successful, permanent forfeiture of property. The tool exists. The underlying intention behind it remains genuinely sound. But its real-world impact on the actual scale of the problem has so far been remarkably limited, a sobering lesson in the gap between strong legislation and effective enforcement. So what happens at the very end of this long, patient story? Eventually, even the most carefully hidden, most carefully structured mansion gets sold. This is a final, and arguably the single most important, stage of the entire cycle, sometimes described by researchers as a cleansing phase. The shell company that has quietly held a Belgravia townhouse for 10 or 15 years, paying property taxes diligently, maintaining the building, occasionally renting it out through a discreet management firm, finally puts it on the open market. A buyer, often a completely unconnected, entirely legitimate purchaser with no idea whatsoever about the property's history, pays full market price to an entirely normal, fully documented, fully legal transaction. The funds from that sale flow back to the original shell company, and from there into whatever new financial structure its ultimate owner now chooses to use. Notice carefully what has just happened in that simple transaction. Money that may have entered the system years earlier as suspicious, untraceable, or even outright criminal in its origin has now passed through the cleanest possible filter available anywhere in the global financial system, a legitimate, arm's-length real estate sale. Fully recorded, fully taxed, and entirely above board from start to finish. The mansion's entire history as a quiet vault for dirty money simply disappears from view. What remains on paper and in practice is nothing more than a clean sale price, deposited into a bank account that no longer raises a single red flag anywhere in the world. This is both the genius and the tragedy of the entire system we have walked through today. Real estate does not just hide wealth temporarily. It actually launders it slowly, patiently, methodically, across years or even entire decades, until the original sin of the money's true origin becomes essentially invisible to anyone looking at the final transaction. By the time the original owner has fully exited the property, regulators, banks, and tax authorities see nothing more than an ordinary, high-value sale between two seemingly unrelated parties. Multiply the single transaction by the thousands upon thousands of similar shell company-owned properties scattered across London's golden postcodes, and you begin to grasp the true scale of what has quietly been happening for decades. Estimates from anti-corruption researchers have suggested that the suspicious property purchases identified in the UK over the past 2 decades could be worth tens of billions of dollars combined. And that figure is almost certainly only the portion that investigators have actually managed to identify and document. The true scale, hidden behind countless layers of shell companies that were never fully unwound or investigated, is very likely far larger than anyone can currently prove. London did not deliberately set out to become the world's premier destination for laundering dirty money through prestigious real estate. It became one almost by accident, through a unique combination of historic architectural prestige, weak transparency laws, an extraordinarily efficient enablers industry, and a golden visa program that, for years, quietly rewarded the size of someone's capital over any meaningful scrutiny of where that capital actually came from. Reforms have slowly begun to arrive. Public registries of beneficial ownership are gradually being built and strengthened. The investor visa route has been permanently closed. Unexplained wealth orders, however imperfect and however limited in practice so far, now exist as a genuine legal weapon in the regulatory arsenal, one that future reforms could eventually sharpen and strengthen. But the ghost mansions remain standing tonight, exactly as they have for years. The lights are still off on some of the most expensive streets on the entire planet. And somewhere right now, quietly, without fanfare, another shell company is signing the papers on house number 1001.